Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jemmy Lontok. Welcome to the seminar series organized by the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics. Allow me to discuss some of the house rules for this afternoon. We will let the speaker finish his presentation first before we entertain questions. To our Zoom participants, kindly stay on mute and stop sharing your video during the duration of the presentation. During our Q&A portion, please virtually raise your hand and wait to be acknowledged. You may unmute and show yourself when asking your question. To our participants joining us via Facebook, please post your question in the comments section. Slides, videos, and other materials from the seminar are posted on our website only when the speaker gives his consent for sharing them. So allow me to introduce our speaker for this afternoon. Our speaker is Associate Professor at the Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Economics. He specializes in applied econometrics and has published in the areas of international migration, education, poverty, and inequality. In 2014, he was awarded as Outstanding Young Scientist in the field of economics by the National Academy of Science and Technology of the Philippines. He is a board member of the nonprofit organization Social Weather Stations, and he obtained his doctorate in economics from the University of the Philippines in 2011. So let us all welcome our speaker for this afternoon to talk about COVID-19 and inequality in the Philippines. We have Dr. Geoffrey M. Ducanes. I now give the virtual floor to Doc Jeff.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Let me just share my screen first. Okay, so good afternoon again, and thank you for attending this seminar on the impact of COVID-19 on inequality in the Philippines. Before I start, let me first acknowledge that this presentation is based on a short paper I wrote for Oxfam that will come out as a chapter in a forthcoming book on the impact of COVID-19 in Asia that will be published by Bloomsbury, India. I wrote the paper before the full year 2021 FICE results came out and before the microdata was made available. So in this presentation, I supplement that chapter I wrote with some analysis of the 2021 FICE, or Family Income and Expenditure Survey. This will be the outline of my presentation. So first, I motivate the presentation by giving a quick background of the impact of COVID-19 on the Philippine economy and why there is reason to believe that inequality could be significantly affected because of it. Next, recognizing that many of the attendees now are students, I give a brief description of the different measures that are used in the literature to measure inequality and also describe the different data sets I used in the analysis. This is followed by a discussion of my hypothesized transmission mechanism from the pandemic to inequality. And then after that, I go to the main results. So first, the short-term impact of the pandemic on inequality. By short-term, I mean the ACQ period. And so this was until the first semester of 2021. The 2021 FICE covers mostly a period that I do not count as being part of the short term. So that is the period I examine next. So the period shortly after the ECQ. And then third, I describe the potential of the pandemic to drive longer term inequality in the country. I end with a summary and a few policy recommendations. So most of us are probably familiar with this, but for the benefit of the few who may not, so the COVID-19 pandemic has exacted a very heavy economic toll on the Philippines. It has caused the largest year-on-year GDP decline in the Philippine economy in the recorded history. Philippine GDP data goes back to after the Second World War, and the 9.5 or 9.6% decline in GDP in 2020 was the largest ever recorded. It also put a halt to the country's longest streak of consistently high GDP growth. Just to compare, the 9.5% decline of Philippine GDP in 2020 is the largest in Southeast Asia. Thailand's economy contracted by 6.1%, and Malaysia's economy contracted by 5.6%. So those are the next ones. And though Philippine GDP grew by 5.6% in 2021, this means that the country's economic output in 2021 was still about 4.5% lower. And more importantly, the per person output was still about 7% lower than they were in 2019. The employment impact of the pandemic was equally severe, as might be expected. After reaching its lowest level of 5.1% in 2019, the annual unemployment rate more than doubled to 10.4% in 2020, as you can see from the figure. And even in 2021, the unemployment rate was still about 1.5 times the pre-pandemic level. It was not until fairly recently that unemployment rate went back to the 5% level. And many of those who remained employed during the pandemic also worked significantly fewer hours. According to the International Labor Organization, the Philippines lost the equivalent of 7.2 million full-time jobs in 2020 and 3.2 million full-time jobs in 2021. Based on data from the Philippine Statistics Authority and other sources, such as the social weather stations, for example, and just our own observations, we know that all of this has increased poverty and hunger. And in this presentation, I also argue that it has likely also increased inequality immediately and possibly in the medium to longer term. I am aware that the 2021 FICE report showed that inequality as measured by the income Gini continued its decline in 2021. But I will show later why that is an incomplete picture at best, and that underneath the figure, there were significant changes in the features of inequality in the country. Why is it important to look at inequality? In many countries in the world, decades of economic growth has reduced absolute deprivation or absolute poverty to such an extent that the focus has shifted to relative deprivation. In the Philippines, of course, we have not removed absolute deprivation ourselves, but based on official data, for example, poverty incidence among families has declined from 21% in 2006 to 13.2% in 2021. There was a slight tweak in methodology in between, but I do not think that was the cause of the decline. In fact, if you look at the medium-term development reports, if you look at the earlier ones, for example, if you look at the MTBDPs before 2004, there was hardly any measure of inequality, maybe just one word or one sentence. It was not until the 2004 to 2010 Philippine Development Plan that there was actually a more substantive discussion of inequality. Before, it was mainly poverty. And of course, since then, inequality has been an important or a more substantial component of the development plans. Inequality is also important because many people believe that inequality itself impacts economic growth and not just the other way around. The old view was that as market economy grows, inequality first increases, and then at some point, inequality declines. That's the Kuznets curve. But there are now many empirical studies arguing that the causation also holds in the other direction, that inequality itself impacts economic growth. Inequality is also seen to affect other things, such as how investments are allocated, the size of the market, and even fertility rate, among others. There is also now a large literature on how inequality has caused socio-political polarization and how it may be responsible for the rise in populism. And of course, just simple introspection tells us that what matters to people is not just what they have, but also what they have relative to what others have. So in other words, inequality itself, the relative standing of people is a function of people's utility function. The most well-known measure of inequality is the Gini ratio. I'm sure you have heard of the Gini ratio. We typically associate inequality with the Gini, I guess in the same way that we associate, for example, photocopiers with Xerox or toothpaste with Colgate. The reason is not clear why the Gini is so popular, but the likely reason, what people say, is that it's because of how well it can be depicted graphically via the Lorenz curve. So the graph in this slide is the Lorenz, the orange line is the yellow curve. So for the sake of the students, if you rank the population from lowest to highest income, and then plot the cumulative share of the population against the cumulative share of income, so you get this this orange curve. Again, this is known as the Lorenz curve. If incomes were perfectly equal, so that the poorest 1% of the population owns 1% of total income, and the poorest 5% owns 5% of total income, then you get the broken blue line here. This will be your Lorenz curve. This is the line of perfect equality. The Gini ratio is just the area above the Lorenz curve, above the orange line, and below the line of perfect equality, divided by the area below the line of perfect equality. So it goes from 0 to 1, from perfect equality to the most extreme inequality, when only one person or household has all the income. However, the Gini has its limitations. For example, scholars in the measurement of inequality say that the Gini ratio is more sensitive to changes in the middle of the distribution than changes at either extremes of the distribution. It also does not have the nice decomposability properties that other inequality measures have. Decomposability meaning, for example, you might want to measure the contribution of different subgroups of the population to inequality, or the contribution of different income sources to inequality. So you cannot do that cleanly with the Gini, but you can do that with other measures. For example, the Atkinson index and the general entropy index. For the Atkinson index and the general entropy index, another advantage is that in both cases, you have something like an inequality aversion parameter that you can include or you can adjust to make your inequality measure more sensitive to the extremes relative to the to the bottom extreme or to the top extreme. So the coefficient of variation and also the tile index, also popular inequality measures, they are special cases of the general entropy index. Other measures of inequality include, of course, comparing decile or quintile shares. A special case is the Palma ratio, which is just the ratio of the top 10%, the share of the poorest 40%. The Philippine Statistics Authority, when it reports on inequality, it reports both the Gini and the Palma ratio as the inequality measures. So in the subsequent analysis I will present, I relied on the following data sets. So first is the Family Income and Expenditure Survey, or the FICE. The FICE is the data used in the computation of official poverty and inequality measures. But it only comes out every 3 years. Though I was told that starting 2023, it will be done every 2 years. Every 3 years is generally fine when the economy is running more or less smoothly, but it is of very limited use in the estimation of the impact of COVID-19 on inequality, because 2020 was very different from 2021, and we only have the FICE for 2021. The year 2020 was the height of the pandemic and the movement restrictions, and the economic impact of the pandemic because of this were most severe in 2020. As we know, there was a big change from 2020 to 2021 in terms of the movement restrictions and the openness of the economy. So relying only on the findings does not tell us what happened to inequality and even poverty because of the pandemic. The second data set is the annual poverty indicator survey. This is done twice every 3 years. It contains a broad income variable, so not as detailed as the FICE, but it has many non-income variables. There was an EPIS in 2020, which was conducted in July, close to the height of the movement restrictions. And finally, I also used the labor force survey, which is the official source of unemployment and labor force participation statistics in the country, also under underemployment. The LFS is conducted every quarter. Just to show what was happening to inequality before the pandemic, so whether you look at per capita income or per capita expenditure, the Gini ratio has been declining since the year 2000, but most especially since 2012 up to 2018. If you measure it using the other inequality measures I mentioned earlier, the Atkinson index or the general entropy index, you will get the same results. But this graph also shows the Gini ratios for 2021. So here you see some difference when you compare the income and expenditure Ginis. There was an obvious decline based on income, so from 43 to 41.7, but it was more or less flat based on expenditure. I will discuss this more later. There are various channels to which the COVID-19 crisis could have impacted inequality in the Philippines. The first one is through the differential impacts of the pandemic on the different economic sectors. The sectors most affected by the pandemic, especially initially, were those that entailed close physical contact among workers or between workers and clients. These include construction, lower-end or non-automized manufacturing, retail trade, personal services such as barbershops, spas, and public transportation. Many types of work in the informal sector fall under this category. And to the extent that workers in these sectors are lower skilled and lower income to begin with, compared, for example, to finance, education, and utilities, then their loss of livelihoods could potentially exacerbate inequality. A second potential channel is through the additional restrictions that were imposed during the strict lockdown, which were biased against lower income households. For example, the extended prohibition of public transportation during the initial ECQ meant that workers who did not own private vehicles and who were beyond reasonable walking distance from their places of work could not resume their jobs. The private ownership of vehicles, for example, is highly unequal in the Philippines, as may be expected and as shown in this table. As you can see, only about 1% of households in the lowest income quintile own cars or jeepneys, compared to 29% of those in the highest income quintile. The ownership of motorcycles or tricycles, which are more limited forms of transportation in terms of the number of passengers that they can accommodate or the distance that they are allowed to travel, is more equitable, but still highly unequal. So note that households with no private vehicles would also have greater difficulty going out to purchase food and other basic necessities during the ECQ. Another example of ECQ restrictions possibly contributing to inequality is the prohibition of face-to-face classes and of young children going out altogether during the ECQ, which potentially disadvantaged working women with children who had to spend more time doing household chores and supervising the schooling of their children. This is especially truer of women who did not have housemaids or kasambahays or yayas. We present evidence of this also later. A third potential channel is through the unequal access of households to technologies that, for workers, would enable work from home arrangements, and for students, would allow access to online schooling and online resources during the pandemic. These technologies include ownership of computers, tablets, mobile phones, as well as broadband connection. lack of access to technology for online education could disadvantage the future earning potential of affected students, thus having a long-term impact on inequality. We likewise present evidence of this unequal access to technology later. Since there was no FICE conducted in 2020, Gini ratio measures of income comparable to those presented earlier is not available. But in the 2020 APIS, conducted in July of the year, and which asked questions about monthly income in the first quarter, which was mostly before the pandemic, and in the second quarter, the beginning of the pandemic and when lockdowns were strictest, the data shows a higher inequality during the pandemic as denoted by a slightly higher Gini ratio. So the Gini in the first quarter of 2020 was 45.7. In the second quarter, it was 46.3. But more importantly, this occurred as mean monthly household income declined across all income quintiles during the period, though the decline was slightly higher in percentage terms for the lowest quintiles, which is why there was a higher inequality. Inequality increased at the beginning of the pandemic because of lower skilled workers who were more likely to belong to, because of the loss of employment among lower skilled workers, who were more likely to belong to lower income households. So they bore the brunt of initial job losses. This is related to the first and second transmission channels I mentioned earlier, since the sectors most affected by the pandemic and the lockdowns in the second quarter of 2020 were wholesale and retail trade, which lost 2 million jobs, construction, which lost 1.4 million jobs, transportation and storage, which lost 1 million jobs, and manufacturing, which lost 800,000 jobs. And these are sectors where workers mainly occupy jobs requiring relatively lower levels of education. So we did a different study trying to tease out the effect of the ECQ on employment outcomes using what is called the difference in difference analysis, and taking advantage of the selective imposition of ECQ. And we found that its effect was mainly in reducing hours worked rather than on reducing the probability of employment. But more relevant for this presentation, we find that the effect of the ECQ on hours worked was somewhat unequal. It was higher for males than females, highest for those in the youngest age group, 15 to 24 years, compared to those in the older age groups, 25 to 40, 40 to 59, 60 and above, and higher for those with incomplete post-secondary education and those with incomplete college education, compared to those who finished college or who finished post-secondary schooling. And we think this is because degree or diploma holders are more likely to be in jobs amenable to work from home arrangements. In another study, looking only at women, we found that the ECQ affected women with children more than those without children in terms of the probability of paid employment. So the ECQ reduced the probability of paid employment for women with children by significantly more compared to women without children, and that moreover, the negative impact of the ECQ on the probability of paid employment increases with the number of children. The more children, the more likely to lose paid employment. And the likely explanation we have is that is the increased care responsibilities of mothers during the ECQ, given that children are forced to be at home and to do distance learning. So now looking at the impact after 1 year. So this means that during the first semester of 2021. So we look at the income poverty statistics released by the PSA based on the FICE data for the first semester of 2021. So this is just the first semester of 2021. But first, a digression. The most widely used income poverty measures are the three Foster-Greer-Torbeck indices. So poverty incidence, poverty gap, and poverty severity. Poverty incidence is just the share of households or individuals who fall below the poverty line. The table on the right is just illustrative data. So for instance, so here you have three countries, country A, country B, and country C, with 10 households each. The cell entries are the per capita incomes of the household. Assume the poverty line is 5,000 pesos. Then the poverty incidence is the same for the three countries. So for each country, there are three households that fall below the poverty line. So the poverty incidence is 30%. The second FGT measure is called the poverty gap, or the poverty gap. So it's a measure of the shortfall of the total population from the poverty line. For two countries with the same poverty incidence, the one with the higher poverty gap have poor who are farther from the poverty line on average. So looking at the table once again, the poor in country A are collectively 3,000 pesos away from the poverty line, because if you give the first household 1,000, the second household 1,000, the third household 1,000, they will already meet the poverty threshold. The poor in countries B and C are collectively 6,000 pesos away from the poverty line. So they are farther away from the poverty line on average. So the poverty gap is higher in countries B and C compared to country A. So in fact, if you do the computation, poverty gap in country A is 6, in country B it's 12, country C the same 12. The third FGT measure is poverty severity, which measures the inequality among the poor. So for two countries with the same poverty incidence and poverty gap, the one with the higher poverty severity indicates that there is more inequality among the poor in that country. It's also the same as saying that there is more extreme poverty in that country. If you compare country B and country C, you will notice that there is more inequality among the poor in country C compared to country B. Because in country B, the poor are the same distance from the poverty line. In country C, you have household number 1, which is significantly farther from the poverty line compared to households 2 and 3. So in other words, there is more extreme poverty in country C. And as a result, if you do the computations, poverty severity is higher in country C. Now, this table in this slide, this shows the FGT indices for the Philippines for the first semester of 2021 compared to the first semester of 2018 based on PSA computations. And it shows increased poverty incidence in the Philippines during the pandemic, reversing a decade-long pattern of declining poverty. It also shows that the poor were generally farther from the poverty line in the first half of 2021 compared to 2018 on average, based on the higher poverty gap. And more importantly, for this presentation, the table shows that there is greater inequality among the poor in the Philippines in the first half of 2021 based on the higher poverty severity index. And these differences are significant at the 10% level of significance. So there are more poor, the poor are further from the poverty line, and there is more inequality among the poor. Now, looking at the full year 2021 FICE data, again, this is a mixed period. So there was an ECQ in April 2021, but the second half of 2021 was more open. One interesting thing is that you see a somewhat different picture when you look at income inequality and when you look at expenditure inequality. So there is an argument among scholars as to which is the better measure of income. There are people who argue that expenditure is a better measure because it more accurately reflects permanent income, which is the true standard of living. And for detailed data, some people also feel that expenditure can be computed more accurately, or can be collected more accurately, because people believe that people are more likely to misreport income rather than expenditure. Of course, in the official statistics, we use income. And for many countries also, they use income when they compute poverty. But the thing here is that using income and expenditure, you get different results. Again, there seems to be a clear decline from 2018 to 2021 when you look at income inequality, the left panel. But when you look at expenditure inequality, it was really flat. Based on the Gini, there was a slight decline, very, very small decline. But based on the Atkinson index, with inequality aversion parameter equal to 2, which makes it sensitive to the bottom of the distribution, the inequality actually increased slightly. Another thing to note is that the change in inequality, even if you're looking at the income Gini, is very different from the previous periods. In the previous years, inequality declined. The Gini declined because income across as income across deciles or quintiles grew, the incomes of those in the lower deciles grew faster than the income of those in the higher deciles. This time, the incomes declined almost across the board, so except for the second decile. And the reason the income Gini declined is that the richest deciles had their incomes decline more, especially the 10th decile. If you look at the expenditure, it is different. The poorest decile suffered the highest decline, followed by the top decile. In absolute values, you get a U-shaped relationship. So it's high for the poorest decile, goes down and then goes up again, and it's actually gets close to the peak for the 10th or the richest decile. Some other features of inequality have changed. As I showed earlier, based on expenditure, there was hardly a change in the measured inequality between 2018 and 2021. But you see an actual change when inequality is decomposed by group contribution. For example, if one decomposes the per capita expenditure inequality by region, what we find is that between regions inequality has declined, but within regions inequality has actually increased. This is likely to do with the ECQ affecting some regions, namely NCR, Calabarzon, and Region 3, more than others. So the average incomes across regions, basically this means that the average incomes across regions have their gaps, have narrowed their gaps, but within regions, there is evidence that inequality has increased. You can also decompose inequality by source of income. So if we decompose inequality by source of income, we also find a notable change. The contribution of, so you can divide household income into wage income, wage and salary income, entrepreneurial income, and then other income. Other income will include, for example, remittances. That's the major part of other income. If you decompose inequality by source of income, what you find is that the contribution of wages to total inequality has increased, but the contribution of entrepreneurial income has declined. And I posit that this has to do with many businesses not being able to operate normally in 2021, including malls, big restaurants, and real estate businesses, many of which are owned by the country's rich families. On the other hand, many small entrepreneurs engaged in community markets, including vibrant community markets. And perhaps this is the reason for the decline in the contribution of entrepreneurial income. In addition, perhaps wage inequality increased because the ECQ favored wage workers who can do their jobs remotely. And these are mainly the college graduates who typically have higher incomes to begin with. I now describe the potential for longer-term impact on inequality of the COVID-19 experience. As we know, the COVID-19 pandemic and the ECQ suddenly forced students in all grade levels into remote learning mode. And given the short time the education system and teachers have had to prepare, the quality of remote learning is likely inferior to the face-to-face learning that was in place before the pandemic. And this has a potentially negative impact on the future productivity of the cohort of students whose education were affected by the pandemic, and thus on future inequality. Moreover, because access to remote learning resources is highly unequal, with less access to those from lower income households, students from lower income households are likely to suffer greater learning deficits. This table shows ownership of personal computer or tablet, cell phone, broadband connection, TV and radio by household income quintile in 2020. It shows ownership of personal computer or tablet is tremendously unequal. Ownership of cell phones, which is likely inferior to personal computers for remote learning purposes, is more evenly distributed, but still favors those in the highest income quintile. 1/4 of households in the lowest quintile reported not having any cell phone. Access to broadband connection was even scarcer and also unequal, with less than half of all households reporting having this type of connection. Access to mobile data is not available from the APIS data, but is also likely to be highly correlated with income. Even TV ownership is still unequal, with close to 40% of households in the lowest quintile reporting having a TV compared to 95% for those in the top quintile. Radio ownership is more equitable, but again, only 36% of households reported owning a radio. By the way, let me acknowledge our student, Simon Lubaco, for doing an earlier version of such a table. If the future productivity of poor children is affected disproportionately because of substantially less access to learning resources, this could lead to higher inequality later on. Unequal access to personal computers and broadband connection contribute to inequality in other ways, such as by making access to health services via telemedicine unequal, and by limiting the ability of those without access to work from home opportunities and online training opportunities. Again, this could impact both short-term and longer-term income and non-income inequalities as well. As an immediate response to the COVID-19 crisis, the Philippine Congress enacted the Bayanihan to Heal as One Act in March 2020, which among others sought to provide to 18 million low-income households an emergency subsidy amounting to between 5,000 and 8,000 pesos for 2 months. This was more popularly known as DSWD's SAP, for Social Amelioration Program. Later, the Philippine Congress expanded support to households by enacting the Bayanihan to Recover as One Act. Under this act, affected households were again entitled to either an emergency subsidy of 5,000 to 8,000 pesos. This includes households in areas under granular lockdown, households with recently returned OFWs, and displaced workers or employees due to COVID-19, including freelancers, self-employed workers, and repatriated OFWs. The Department of Labor and Employment created 3 programs: the CAMP, which targeted affected formal sector workers, TUPAD, which was targeted to informal workers, and the ACAP, which was targeted to affected OFWs. This table, which is computed from the FIES, shows the incidence of benefits from the 4 programs described above as of June 2020. Of course, the programs extended beyond June 2020. But the 3 months from April to June 2020 were very critical, as this was the period when the lockdowns were most severe and the unemployment was at the record level. As of June 2020, only 46.7% of households reported receiving a cash grant. And though the incidence of SAF benefits was progressive, meaning lower quintiles, larger share benefiting, it was perhaps not progressive enough, as 45% of households in the first and second quintiles still did not benefit. As of June 2020, the DOLE programs had relatively fewer beneficiaries. CAMP was aggressive as of June 2020, with higher income quintile households having a higher share of beneficiaries. Well, this is to be expected, as higher income households typically have better educated workers who are more likely to be in formal sector jobs, because CAMP targeted formal sector workers. TUPAD, which was for informal sector workers, was more progressive, but still only a very small share, 1% or less of households in the lowest quintiles reported benefiting from the program as of June 2020. ACAP was also regressive, as OFWs typically come from higher income households. And of course, as you can see from the last column, the percent of households receiving ACAP is also very, very small. So to conclude, the COVID-19 pandemic has exacted a heavy toll on the livelihood of many Filipino households. I presented evidence that some subgroups of Filipino households were more affected than others, likely increasing income and non-income inequality in the country in the short term and potentially in the longer term. Inequality that existed prior to the pandemic, such as in access to social security, in educational attainment and economic opportunities, in access to digital technology, has contributed to the unequal impact of the pandemic across households. Most workers from low-income households in the country are in the informal sector, thus lacking access to social security and unemployment insurance during the crisis. Additionally, being in the informal sector also meant that they had difficulty availing of government support that relied on government databases in identifying beneficiaries. Moving forward, improving their access to social and unemployment insurance will provide them a crisis safety net and reduce the likelihood of a similar crisis in the future, exacting as much suffering in the country. There are already many existing models of how to expand social insurance coverage for informal sector workers, such as by subsidizing social security contributions for low-income earners, and by simplifying the process of registration and providing limited time tax exemptions for micro, small, and medium enterprises who registered their enterprises and workers. Narrowing the digital divide is likewise critical in tempering the rise in inequality in the post-COVID-19 era. Increased reliance on digital technology via blended learning, for instance, is likely a permanent feature of the educational system. Subsidizing learning gadgets and access to internet for students for lower income households, perhaps as an attached program to the already existing conditional cash transfer program for children and pregnant mothers from poor households, will reduce the likelihood that they are left behind. In poor communities, student access to the internet can be provided via community hubs, such as the barangay centers. Workers have to be trained in digital skills, or more broadly, in 21st century skills, to capacitate them to engage in new employment opportunities, including remote employment opportunities. And also for entrepreneurs to allow them or to enable them to reach new markets that have emerged in a world more reliant on e-commerce. the long period of time it took from when the government support programs were announced to the time the benefits reached their intended targets also added avoidable misery to the pandemic. The problem cited was the outdated and incomplete database on which to base the identification of beneficiaries. So moving forward, there is a need to design the delivery system for government support in times of emergency to reach intended beneficiaries quickly, utilizing digital payments if possible, transparently and fairly. The design should be in place before the next potential national emergency, utilizing the national ID system, registration that is now ongoing, combined with other government databases such as the DSW Listahanan, where proxy means testing is required. So undertaking these actions will help ensure that those who were behind before the pandemic are not left even further behind after the pandemic. Of course, some of these recommendations are not new and have already been expressed in the government's previous medium-term development plans. The country's pandemic experience highlights the importance of putting all this in practice. So I end my presentation here. Thank you.
So thank you very much, Doc Jeff, for those valuable insights showing the relationship between or the impact of COVID-19 on inequality. At this point of our program this afternoon, we now open the floor for questions. So we have three ways. You can raise your hand so that I can call you, and then you can personally ask your question, or you can also type your question in the Zoom chat, and I will read it. And then to our participants joining us in Facebook, you can also type in the comment section, and we will also ask those questions. So to get the ball rolling with respect to our Q&A, we have a first question coming from one of our Zoom participants, Mr. Steve Chavez. So the question of Steve is the following. If contribution to inequality by entrepreneurship has declined, then should it be interpreted that income from entrepreneurship has increased because it shortens inequality?
Should I answer now, Jamie? Okay.
Yes, Dr. Jeff, floor is yours.
So what it actually means is that the inequality in entrepreneurial income has declined. So this can I mean, based on the observation, this likely happened because the big entrepreneurs, such as, for example, the owners of the malls, the owners of big restaurants, as mentioned earlier, the owners of real estate companies, their incomes has declined during the pandemic, especially during the ECQ. At the same time, the entrepreneurial income of lower income households, such as those who engaged in vibrant community markets, for example, has increased. So the combination of those is what has made entrepreneurial income more equal, which reduced its contribution to total inequality.
And we have a response. Thank you, Dr. Jeff, for answering that question. And our participant, Steve, thanks you for that clarification on that particular matter. Now we move on to the second question, and this is from Mr. Carl Galvez, also a Zoom participant. Hello, Sir Jeff. What does the data say, if any, with regard to inequality in education outcomes in basic and higher education? And how can we study it?
Outcomes in terms of performance, there's no data yet. But outcomes in terms of participation, that you can get from preliminary data you can get from either the labor force survey, because that's done quarterly, so you can monitor what's happening more frequently, and also to some extent the annual poverty indicator survey, but only up to June 2020. Unfortunately, because of based on the APIS, you don't really see any effect yet, because the APIS was conducted in July when the schools were having their break. So when they were asked whether they were enrolled or not, or whether they stopped schooling because of in the past 6 months, you cannot really capture yet the effect of what happened during in the following school year, which was when the main impact of the pandemic occurred. But again, just based on the observation and also based on preliminary analysis of the LFS data, and just based on the enrollment data that was reported by DepEd in 2020, if I remember correctly, in K-12, there was a decline of about more than 2 million enrollees. So that's a big effect. And the LFS doesn't have any information on income, but again, the likely scenario is that students from lower income households were the ones more likely to skip or to skip schooling, again because of no or poorer quality access to remote learning.
So thank you, Dr. Jeff, for answering that question. Again, we invite our participants in Zoom and in Facebook to ask your questions at this particular part of our program. While we wait for that next question, so allow me to throw the third question. So my question is, after seeing how the situation is right now, what would you think would be the urgent piece of legislation or policy that would still be doable as we close out the year 2022 with respect to minimizing the adverse impact of COVID-19 on inequality?
So I think there are ongoing efforts now in Congress. I know that, for example, there are moves to put in place unemployment insurance. I think that will be a big step towards improving social protection for lower income households. And definitely, if there was unemployment insurance in place already in the country before the pandemic, the impact on poverty and hunger will not be as bad. In other countries, for example, where unemployment insurance was in place, like some of our Southeast Asian neighbors, like Thailand, for example, the impact of the pandemic on household welfare was not severe. So I think because that one is already ongoing, the unemployment insurance initiatives, I think that one can be pursued. And related to the earlier question, again, there's not been a lot of there's not been much of an examination on the impact, on the granular impact of the pandemic on enrollment. Perhaps now there's more data by DepEd to see who have dropped out. Maybe some assessments have already been done as to what was the impact on learning outcomes. And I think as soon as possible, there should be steps undertaken to remedy whatever deficiencies that might have occurred in the learning of students during the 2 years that they were doing remote learning. So either through tutorials or through supplementary materials or even on-the-job training. So I think this should be done as quickly as possible, as soon as possible, so that this cohort of students do not suffer the long-term impact of the pandemic on their productivity.
So thank you, Dr. Jeff, for answering my question. Now we have a raised hand, and I give the virtual floor to Dr. Carl Handok of the UP School of Economics. Dr. Carl, the floor is yours for your question.
Yeah, thank you. Sorry, Jeff, I'm driving and I'm malapit na mag-coding, so I'm taking the side streets. So again, congratulations on the very insightful presentation. I'm really, it's nice to know all these things regarding poverty, and I have been crunching the numbers myself. And the curious thing that I saw in your presentation is that inequality from 2018 to 2021 has decreased in spite of increasing poverty. But poverty would have been higher had poverty incidence in BARM not decrease. So there's a large, around 20 to 30 percentage point decrease in poverty incidence in BARM. Lanao del Sur alone, the poverty incidence has decreased by uh, by by about half. And so that has probably, because of the increase in incomes from BARM, which is the region with the with the most poor populations, and any increase in income would be salutary to income inequality. I'm curious to hear your thoughts on the types of policy that can sustain this um, poverty, this huge poverty reduction in BARM, and if there are any differences between, like, current policies that you see which are in place, and other future policies which you think can help sustain this. So just curious to hear your thoughts, Jeff, on this. Thanks.
Yeah, I think that the large decline in poverty in BARM, it merits further examination. I have not looked at it deeply myself, but I think I will wait for the data, the combined FICE LFS data, to see whether it's a real change, it's a real poverty decline, or something more artificial because of some change in data. The only possible thing that I think can account for a larger decline in poverty in BARM is that they may have benefited from the SAP, but they may not have been as affected by the pandemic in terms of loss in income. So that the SAP basically was an additional income for them. But assuming that the change in poverty in BARM is a real change, not just an artificial change because of the data. I mean, BARM is still a highly agricultural region. So I think reducing poverty in BARM will require essentially raising agricultural productivity. Raising agricultural productivity means that doesn't mean moving people into agriculture. It's the opposite. It's making the sector more productive so that you can move people out of agriculture into other areas, probably related to agriculture, such as food manufacturing. So I think so BARM, it has to be increasing agricultural productivity, and I don't know, maybe I've heard pronouncements by President Marcos Jr. that he has big plans for the agricultural sector, including attracting more college graduate workers in agriculture by giving them lands if they decide to work as farmers. So yeah, nothing new, the same thing, increasing agricultural productivity by providing the necessary infrastructure support, and also research and development, and those things.
Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Dr. Handok, and thank you, Doc Jeff, for answering the question. Now we go back to the Zoom chat as we have additional questions. We have a question from Adrian Mitchell Galano. How did COVID-19 affect inequality in access to healthcare in the country?
So what I showed earlier was that there was a very unequal access across the population groups in terms of access to the internet, access to mobile phones, even basically access to communication technology. For example, during the ECQ, you cannot really go out to visit your doctors, especially the senior citizen, because they were not allowed to go out. This means that the only people who can access healthcare were the people who knew doctors, who can call doctors, or later on who had access to what do you call that, telemedicine, because in late 2021, the Department of Health already made telemedicine more available. So again, because the pandemic affected access to healthcare in that way, that poor households who had less access to communications technology were able to access healthcare less because they couldn't access telemedicine.
Thank you, Doc Jeff. So in the interest of time, we are down to our last question. So this last question is from Mr. Tommy Lazaro. So his question is, which regions are affected most by the impact of COVID-19? And do we have regions where the situation has not changed at all?
At the height of the lockdowns, of course, the most affected regions were the regions where the lockdowns were strictest. So these are NCR, again, NCR, Calabarzon, and also Region 3, but mostly Calabarzon and NCR. So if you measure the effect, for example, in terms of hours worked lost, in terms of full-time equivalent employment lost, the most losses were in NCR and Calabarzon. So in that sense, they were the most affected regions. This is also the reason why, when I showed earlier the contribution to inequality by region, the contribution of the between groups has declined. It's the within region inequality that has increased. The between regions inequality has declined because relative to the incomes of the other regions, the incomes in NCR and Calabarzon, they dropped more, or they dropped by a bigger percentage.
So thank you, Doc Jeff. And yeah, thank you for your presentation, and thank you for also answering those questions. For those whose questions weren't asked in our Q&A, you can send them via email or to our social media platforms, and we will send them to Doc Jeff so that they can also be answered eventually. So again, thank you, Doc Jeff. Now, I would like to request the admin of the Economics Department to kindly start sharing the screen again. So we would like to invite everybody to our next webinar, Monopsony in Philippine Labor Markets and its Implications on Gender Discrimination. And our speaker for that seminar will be Dr. Leonardo M. Lanzona, Jr., Professor of the Ateneo de Manila University. This will be on October 26, 2022, Wednesday at 10 a.m. Kindly visit our website for materials from previous seminars. And we also invite you to visit us in our various social media platforms. So we are present in YouTube, we are present in Facebook, we are present in Instagram, and we are present in Twitter.